Okay, hi everybody. No, I'm not leaving, I'll explain. Once again, we are honored to host Richard Cronin, historian and author, on another one of our special author events that we hold monthly here at the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation. And when you probably have heard of these on our email list, if you get them at wghf.org, you can sign up for alerts and events coming up, so you won't be able to miss any of these fascinating historical presentations we do. So Richard, we thank you. Also, I want to mention the next one, which is August 7th, right here in this room. We're opening a new exhibit called Trailblazers, the history of camping and scouting in West Orange County. All right. Yeah, that's prop, you know. I didn't go on any camping trips as a kid because I had asthma, so I had to stay home while everybody went to Staten Island and had fun in the woods. So I had to stay in Brooklyn and just read. Anyway, now I'm making up for it. But August 7th, here in this room, we're going to have a little event, an opening event for the next exhibit, written by Will McCoy, our writer-curator. Wonderful work, Will. And that's at the museum now. We're in the process of finishing it up, right? Right. Just adding some more artifacts. In fact, these came from John Kappelman, Dr. John Kappelman, our local Dr. Kildare, who was very, very big in scouting. He was very involved in Troop 210. So he's going to be doing a talk on the history of Troop 210 that night here in this room, August 7th. We'd love to have you all attend. And then we'll all troop over to the museum to see what I said. And we'll see the new exhibit that Will just put up. We're very proud of it. It's great work, Will. We thank you so much. And that's it. We'll see you in August. And of course, business before that. Richard?
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much.
I'm going to take this off now.
Everybody hear me all right? I always love coming here. I posted a picture of an event I did here 10 years ago. It was my first event in this Heller Hall right here. I always love coming over here because of the people I meet. Everybody seems like they're connected with the early pioneers, which is who I love to talk about. And so I'm going to talk to you tonight about some interesting pioneers. Yeah, you're going to hear your name spoken tonight, and you might hear your name spoken tonight, and I know you're going to hear your name spoken tonight. So with that, let me get started. I like to deal with the 19th century. There's a lot of great history in this area, in the 20th and even the 21st century and whatever, but I'm stuck back in the 19th century. Those were the earliest people, the people that I call the bravest of the brave. In 1840, before Florida was a statehood, there was 54,000 people in all of Florida and 54,000 square miles of Florida. So there was one person per square mile. Now, most of those people lived up in the Panhandle, in St. Augustine, Jacksonville, Tallahassee. So when you take those people into account, the distribution is even less. So there was really, in 1840, there was hardly anybody in this area here. In fact, it was questionable to most people that this was actually Indian reservation. A guy by the name of Horatio Dexter in 1820 wrote that everything west of the St. Johns River was Indian reservation. That would be us. So consequently, not many people came here at that particular time. But around in the early 1850s, a few people decided to venture out and settle in this particular area. They are people that I started writing about 12 years ago when I first started writing history. One of the most fascinating individuals that I had ever, to this day, come upon was Isaphina Cleopatra Ellington Spear, and she lived here, and I'll be getting to her in a little bit. But so from the very start, there were some very fascinating individuals. Well, as we start to celebrate 250 years of America, it occurred to me a while back, I wonder how these people associate with those who we call the patriots of the American Revolution. According to Ancestry, 1 in 9 people in America have connections to patriots who fought in the American Revolution. I happen to have no connection whatsoever. Every ancestor that I trace came here well after the American Revolution. But my lovely wife, Debbie, her family, I trace back, she actually she could qualify for a daughter of the American Revolution. And it's something that's getting more and more involved, it seems like. There's more and more people wanting to try and find out if they have connections either to the sons of the American Revolution or the daughters. So where I got started thinking is this. You probably heard one of these or both of these phrases, like father like son, or she's her mother's daughter. I believe firmly that in the past that was more of a phrase or two that made sense, because when you start looking at the founders who came here after the Civil War, which us historians mostly like to talk about. This town was founded by a veteran of the Civil War. That town was founded by a veteran of the Civil War. We tend to stick with the Civil War. But those individuals who came here were some fascinating individuals, and many of them had some of the most popular names at that time. First and middle names were Benjamin Franklin. We have Benjamin Franklin Whitner relative right here. George Washington something or other. I don't think we have any George Washingtons here. Isaac Newton Rutland. The names of the past became the first and middle names of a lot of our American pioneers, because people really they were in touch with their roots. And so I think a lot of people were affected by how they grew up. I know I have a certain amount of my father in me, and I know my wife Debbie has a certain amount of her father and mother in her. So I think we are, maybe even before the day of technology, we were affected a lot more so, I think, by our family and our upbringing. So as we start the 250th anniversary, which is next July, all this year we're going to be hearing more and more about what took place. I wanted to do a special tribute to some degree as for this particular area here. Oakland, Winter Garden, and Ocoee. These three particular places have some fascinating individuals, and I'm going to be telling you about some of how they relate to patriots of the American Revolution. We start in 1843. This is a survey. This is the very first survey of this area. If you wanted to know where we were, we're right about where the number 14 is there, right at this particular moment. But every property bill that you have, if you're a homeowner, wherever you live, whether it be Maitland or out here in Oakland or Winter Garden, if you have a property bill, your first 6 digits are based upon the surveys that were done in 1840s. You will look at your surveys and it'll tell you your section, township, and range, and that's what this is. This happens to be section, this section here, 22, is of Township 27 East, range, or 20, I'll get to it in a second. There it is right here, 22 South, 27 East. So each one of these sections, if you looked at your property tax bill, you would see the section and the township range on it, because that was what we still use today. The work that people did by hand, 3 people, a surveyor and 2 helpers with chains and sights, and they had to clear straight lines, and they had to lay out, and they had to determine all this with no GPS system at all. And they were so accurate in doing it that we still use it today when you buy a piece of property to be based upon that. But George Washington, his cousin, a cousin of George Washington, Henry Washington, was the very first individual who came pretty darn close. He did the southern boundary. That's all he did in 1843. So I'm not going to get into him a whole lot, but Henry Washington did a lot of surveying around here, and he was a cousin of George Washington. But in 1849, a gentleman by the name of Frederick Loren came back, and he actually performed this survey. He did this work. This section here, this red, that would be 1 square mile. 1 mile by 1 mile, 1 square mile. And he laid out this whole thing. And it was he that actually produced, as I said, the records that we use to this day. His patriot was Reuben Loring, who was a private in the New York Regiment War of 1812. So we're going to start with him. So by 1849, there was really nobody living here yet that we could record. Why? The reason we needed these surveys done was that the surveys is how they wrote a homestead deed. If you wanted to come here and settle, let's say you wanted to settle right here on the shore of Lake Apopka, and you wanted to own that piece of property, the government said you could have it either free or $1.25 an acre, but you could have that. The first question you would want to ask them is, how can I be sure this is my piece of property? So these surveys had to be done in order to encourage people to come down here, file homesteads, and settle here. So, as I said, this is 1 square mile. By 1849, they could finally write homestead deeds for any brave individual who would want to come from civilization and settle here. And in 1856, one of the very first individuals who did so was James D. Stark. James D. Stark owned this green area here. He later sold it in late 1856 to Isafina C. Spear. He owned 170 acres. We know from a later homesteader by the name of Robert B. F. Roper, a young lad who went into downtown Orlando with his father in 1861, he later wrote that the reason Stark sold his property to Isafina Spear was that he had slaves, but he was also afraid that they were going to have the fever. And so he needed to get away from the lake and go inland. And so he did go inland. And I'll get to that in just a second. This is a picture of James D. Stark, an interesting individual, because in 1860, as again, he was a slave owner. He was also the state senator for section 19, or the 19th district of Orange County. And I'll get to that more of that. So, the patriot of this gentleman, Stark, is Captain James Rochelle through his mother's side, Margaret Rochelle. He would be the great-grandfather of Stark. So Stark, this is Stark's property here. In 1856, at the same time that Stark was buying this property, a gentleman by the name of Isaac Hudson brought his son Edward Hudson, and they settled on this land here, but increased to have this land, and this star is to show you where we are sitting at this very moment. This, you all know today, is Oakland. And this is the road in between, which is later became Tildenville and all. So by 1856, the only two families that were living out here were Stark and Hudson. Stark, as I said, sold his property to this lady here. Fortunately, I got this picture right from this great organization right here, the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation. I knew her for years without knowing what she looked like until they said, hey, we got her picture. Isophenis C. Ellington Spear. She was the first wife of James G. Spear, who is most notable for this particular area. Now let me back up just a second about this gentleman, Stark. In 1860, he was elected to serve in the 19th district, as I said, of Orange County, which included a little bit outside into what is now Lake County as well. But when he went up to the state capitol in November of 1860, he and the other senators reached a deal to abdicate their legal authority. They made a deal in November and passed a resolution, of which Stark voted for, that they would agree and be bound by whatever decision the delegates of the Florida Secession Convention were to make. So their legal responsibility was to actually make laws for the state, but they gave that authority over to individuals that to this day we're not sure how they got their offices. They were supposedly elected, but there's no record of how these people got elected. So when you see the state convention and you look and see who voted against secession, what you will find is that someone voted against secession from the 19th district of Orange County, and his name was Isaac Newton Rutland. And we'll get into more on him in a second. So what did Stark do? Well, if we go back up here, Stark said, I got to get away from the lake. I'm worried that we're going to get the fever. So I'm going to move inland. So what he did is he moved to Ocoee, settled there on a lake that today is still called Stark Lake. All right, so we're still back to here now. We've got Stark and we've got Hudson. Hudson came eventually from Talladega. There is so much history packed in this Hudson property that is just quite remarkable. You see, a young lad came down and brought his wife and child from Talladega also. Isaac Hudson and his son Edward Hudson came down from Talladega, but for a 1-year period, another gentleman came down that they were family related, but his name was Benjamin F. Caldwell. Benjamin F. Caldwell came down here and lived for 1 year in 1857, and he left. He went to Texas at the end of that year. What is so extraordinary about that? Because the city of Orlando it was founded on a 4-acre piece of property, 4-acre square, that was donated to them by Benjamin F. Caldwell. The person that owned land right next to him in Orlando is Isaac Hudson. When you talk about history of Central Florida, and especially Orange County, if you leave out Oakland, Winter Garden area, I'll tell you what, you lose a lot of history. So Isafina buys her property, and they move out here, as best as we can tell, in 1856. And where did she move from? She and James G. Spear moved from Lake Ivanhoe. They owned a piece of property. Thanks to this gentleman right here, I can prove that they owned a piece of property and lived on it at on Lake Ivanhoe, because Steve Patrick gave me a copy of the envelope that it was written and mailed in 1854, saying from a gentleman by the name of George Self. And he said, hey, I bought this piece of property, but there's somebody on my land, and his name is James G. Spear. And there was a good reason for that. But anyway, Isafina, quite an incredible woman. I loved writing about her, but she was the granddaughter of Patriot Jeremiah Ellington. He lived in Albemarle County, and he was a rancher, and he provided food for the Continental Army. And relatives of Isafina. Isafina never got into the Daughters of the American Revolution because she died 23 years before the organization was even formed. But family members from her, and the Ellingtons had like 13 children. There are members of the Ellington family that are now members of the DAR. So quite extraordinary. And here's where I said, like I said, Stark went to Ocoee. Ocoee is actually known today to be founded by Benjamin Sims. And he actually came much later, but he did settle on the south side, and he didn't name Ocoee because Benjamin Sims came from Ocoee, Tennessee, and named it thus. So, by the time 1859 rolls around, James and Isafina Spear, they have increased their land holdings, so they own from lake to lake, including Lake Johns, Johns Lake, Lake Johns, plural single. Sometimes it has apostrophe, sometimes it doesn't. I've been asked numerous times, how did Lake Johns, I can give you a half a dozen possibilities, but nobody knows for sure, absolute sure. But the Hudsons, both the father and the son lose their wife in the same year in 1858. And in 1859, they strike a deal with William C. Roper to sell their land, and they go to Texas. Both the father and the son are dead by the end of the Civil War out in Texas. So much of their history is lost to this area. But the Ropers came. He came in 1859, bought it, and then he went back and got his family and brought, I think it was 30 wagon loads of people, came down with them to settle. Back to Robert B.F. Roper, his son, wrote that when they got there, there was plenty of houses on the plantation for everybody. Who was everybody? Well, everybody was the Dunaways came down with them, and the Reams family came with them. And as I said, there for a while, the Benjamin Franklin Caldwell had been living on this land here. So Roper, he also starts expanding his property, and so now Roper owns land that is actually all the way over to where Winter Garden is now. But oddly enough, in 1860, William C. Roper opens the very first post office in this whole area. He owns, this is where he's living, this is his plantation, and he opens the Oakland Post Office in 1860. It was closed down at the start of the Civil War, and Oakland didn't have a post office until after James G. Spear opened it much later. But there for a very short time, Oakland had a post office where Winter Garden is. I did a talk here once about when Winter Garden was Oakland, and I think some people were taking shots at me, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, Richard Roper. His grandfather was Patriot Reverend Richard Roper, and he was a patriot of the American Revolution. William's daughter, Frances C. Roper, married Bluford Sims, who founded Ocoee. She, in turn, eventually, when she their daughter married, they went to Pine Castle, and that was the Brannan family. And they lived in Pine Castle for many, many years, including they had a son, Major General Ernest Brannan. All of these tie back to a patriot by the name of Richard Roper. Then we come to James G. Spear. James G. Spear is probably mentioned more in Orange County history than any name that you will ever find, and probably for good reason. he lived until he was 1892, he lived until the year 1892. He was one of the oldest of the original people. He came here in 1854. So from 1854 all the way to 1892, he was here. And so he definitely had a great influence on the area. He is credited with founding the city of Orlando. He was actually the attorney for Benjamin Franklin Caldwell, who had donated that land. And Caldwell was living in Tallahassee. He was a young man, only 20-some years old. And so he had James G. Spear handle the transactions down here. So who all founded the city of Orlando? That's a subject for a whole nother talk in a whole nother different part of Orange County. But he did have neighbors. His neighbors were William C. Roper and Caroline Reams Roper. Andrew Dunaway, he married Catherine Reams Dunaway, the sister, and their brother was Bartlett B. Reams. So the whole family came and settled. But James G. Spear, his patriot was William Spear, who was the aide-de-camp at the Battle of Kettle Creek under General Andrew Pickens. This is a lot more than just one out of every 9. It's like everybody has this connection around here to settling this area that has a wide range of patriots. So in February of 1869, James G. Spear is a widower. He became a widower in the year 1867. What happened was, during the Civil War, this was not the best area to be around. And so, for some unknown reason, they decided to go to where Dunedin is today. So by 1867 and 68, James G. Spear and Isafina are living down off of the Gulf Coast. Their son later wrote about driving cattle down along the coast with his father. So in 1867, Isafina dies over in Dunedin. And James comes back. I should back up and say, before they left, they sold their property. They sold all of Oakland to the parents of Mary Elizabeth Jackson. By the time he came back, a widower, both of her parents are deceased. And so James G. Spear married Mary Elizabeth Jackson, who was the great-granddaughter of Patriot Moses Jackson. So then we come to Oakland. I see, you recognize right off of your relative. Oakland, good old Oakland. Right now, Oakland is known, when it comes to the name Vic, is best known for having the first female woman in, I want to say, the state of Florida. I had found one record that said she was the very first in the nation, and I've never really been able to verify that, but I tend to believe that she was the very first female mayor in the town of Oakland. She won with 12 votes to 11, but she still won, which was quite a record. But I'm not here to talk today about her. I want to talk about her mother. Her mother was Sarah Catherine Rutland Vick. I've written a number of books over the last dozen years, and no book that I have written has had more comments, more discussions, more emails sent to me than my book, The Rutland Mule Matter. And I'll tell you why. Sarah Catherine Rutland Vick was born on the Wekiva River in 1862. History in Orange County gets so discombobulated that sometimes we tend to really lose sight of the facts. But if you were to go across 429 Bridge and drop off and go into the park right there that's on the called Wilson's Landing, it's a cool little park. You can walk down and you can actually look right at the Wekiva River. That's not Wilson's Landing. It was really the homestead of Isaac Rutland. And his daughter, Sarah, was born on that homestead in 1862, right after the war had started. Right after he came back, her father came back from Tallahassee after voting no to secession. So this is an incredible family. Isaac was not one of the most favorite individuals in Orange County. There were two people from Orange County that voted no, William Woodruff and Isaac Rutland. But William Woodruff survived the Civil War. Sarah's father did not. Now, if you read Eve Bacon's History of Oakland, you will find that they say that her father was killed by Indians, which he was not. Her father was killed by Orange Countyans who were in Gainesville, Florida, looking for him, looking for the traitor, because he was working on the Union side. I recently had a conversation through emails with a gentleman in North Carolina. You know him? I was doing an update on my Rutland book, and this is the honest truth. I'm doing this writing, and Ezekiel C. Vick is a big character in the book. So is Sarah, the two. But Sarah's brother was Othman Rutland, Othman, unusual name. Sometimes they called him Other Man because he had an older brother, but his name was really Othman. So I'm doing my update because I wanted to have a fresh, new look at this book. And I stopped to review my emails, and I look, and there's an email from Ezekiel Vick. And I said, come on, this is crazy. So I open it up, and sure enough, it's a Vick, Ezekiel Vick from North Carolina, saying, I think you wrote a book about my ancestor. And so he and I started this conversation, and after he read the book and found out what happened, he said, I don't know what to think about it. And I said, think about this. This is the best way to think about it. This was a man of principle. Believe me, I know about a man of principle. My father was a city editor of a newspaper that had been sold to the employees, and then the publisher started taking advantage of that position by taking huge bonuses, and my father stormed in and said, this has got to stop. It didn't stop. My dad was fired. But my dad always said, I would have rather gotten fired than to overlook that. Isaac Rutland truly believed that Florida should not have exited as a state in the Union. He was dead convinced of that. That he knew that Florida was in the wrong. And that's why he not only voted no, but afterwards he stayed in Tallahassee to make sure that the new Constitution didn't get any crazier than it needed to be. He actually voted on and was a member of the new Constitution for the Confederacy. So then he came back here. So he tried his best to get Florida back into the state. So looking back through history, people do stupid things, countries do stupid things. Should we have left the Union or whatever? We're not there. We can't really judge what people knew then. We only can judge based upon what we can do now. So I think the best thing to do is be proud of the fact that the man stood up by his conviction right to the end. My problem after finding Ezekiel Vick, Rutland, was I looked and the state House of Representatives had left him off of the history of all of the lawmakers from 1822 to present day. Isaac Rutland wasn't on there. And so I wrote to him and I said, you're dead wrong here. You left off some people. You need to put Isaac Rutland on there. Well, I get this sweet letter from them saying, no, we looked it over. We're not going to include him because we only have lawmakers. So I wrote back to them and I said, wait a minute. The 9th District State Senator abdicated his responsibility to a delegate that delegate acted in good faith and took the state out and then stayed there and wrote the Constitution, and the Constitution is what our laws are. So Isaac Rutland is a lawmaker. You can now find in my updated book at the back, you will find that he is now listed in our state House of Representative records, along with several others that they had left out. So I always have felt very good about the fact that I took on City Hall and won. Anyway, if you really want an interesting read, I highly recommend the Rutland Mule Matter. It will tell you some astonishing things about Central Florida history during the Civil War. Sarah Catherine, her patriot is Moore Stevenson, and that's through her family. So anyway, this is a Rutland Mule. I kind of talked probably more about it than I should have at this extent. So let's move on. So right now, Spear has a lake named for him, and Roper has a lake. Oddly enough, they're not here. They're south of here. But I guess maybe it was afterthought. I mean, Lake Roper is down near the cemetery, and I think it was named when they donated land for the cemetery. So where's Lake Tilden? Because Luther Tilden is another pioneer. Anybody know where Lake Tilden is? Well, it is found in my new book, Historic Florida Lakes and Waterways. It's one of 415 lakes and waterways that are tell you how they came into being. But actually, and Stark Lake is included in that, as is Sims and Spear and Roper. But Lake Tilden is actually in Apopka. It's right where 436 and 441 split. The old Townsend house right there. There's a little lake in front of it. And that's Lake Tilden. Why is that Lake Tilden? That was where the Luther Tilden and his wife first settled when they came to Orange County. That was where their first homestead was. So they named Lake Tilden. When they came down this way, they weren't allowed to bring the lake with them. So the lake had to stay up there. I think his patriot is Calvin Tilden, who was the captain of the Massachusetts Regiment. And of course, that became when he came down here, he ended up building platting a little town called Tildenville. This is actually the Apopka Lake called Lake Tilden. All right, and then we come to Crown Point. Although she didn't really she didn't always call herself associated with Crown Point. Sometimes he was Winter Garden. But on the 1890 J.O. Freeze map, this is the station, Winter Garden Station. This is where we are right now. And this shows the house of E.D.M. Perkins, the husband of this lady right here. And her name was Elizabeth Jane Jenny Sanders Perkins. She was actually a columnist for the Florida Agriculturist, appeared often, wrote a lot of articles in the 1880s, and this is what she called Floral Notes. Mrs. Jenny S. Perkins lived right here in Winter Garden, so you guys had a publisher, author right here. Her patriot is Benjamin Sanders, and this is one of those that I could actually trace right back to the DAR. You were asking me about how you find your relatives. If you go this number, once you find the DAR number of your ancestor will take you right back to tell you what that patriot did. And in this case, her great-great-grandfather or great-grandfather actually delivered groceries to our soldiers. And this building you probably recognize. There's a little confusion throughout history as to who gave this building over, but this is the First Baptist Church right next door. In 1890, the executrix of the will of David E. Washburn, deceased, of Yonkers, New York, signed over this property so that the Winter Garden Baptist Church could be built. She actually gave it to the Winter Garden Baptist Church. And so David E. Washburn owned a lot of the land from this point east and all the way down to the lake. He too has a patriot who fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. His patriot was Elijah Washburn, who served with Captain Israel Putnam. What is it about David E. Washburn? Well, I was just telling Jim earlier today, we were talking about about 10 years ago when they opened this facility. They put together a skit, 3 different skits on how Winter Garden got his name, and one of the skits was out of my book that I had released at that time called Ghost Towns and Phantom Trains, in which I showed where David E. Washburn was in Berlin, Germany on vacation in 1890 when he got interrupted and had to go to the embassy and sign a release for the Orange Belt Railway so that they could put the railroad across his property. Now, on the face, that may not seem all that unusual, but by 1891, when he did that, the railroad had already been crossing that property for 5 years. And what was happening is that they were doing an audit, I believe, of the Orange Belt Railway, who desperately needed money from Drexel Burnham to keep the railroad operating, and they found out that one tiny piece of property coming at an angle crossed over David Washburn's land, and that they did not have a right-of-way signed release. So they interrupted the guy's vacation when he was in Berlin, Germany, and you can find in Orange County Records has the actual document that is signed by the staff at the Berlin, Germany, signing off on his name and witnessing his name, giving Orange Belt Railway the right to continue operating. And where were they operating? Right about here on the opposite end of this building is that tiny piece of property that excuse me, that Washburn owned. That property ended up in the ownership later of Earl Wayne Ewing, who platted not this depot, but from the back of this depot north, all the way over to the street that the church is on. He didn't actually plat it. His father did, because Earl had already died. He had done an earlier plat of Winter Garden, and he owned this land. And apparently Dad knew of Earl's plans, and so his dad went ahead and platted the land. And lots 25, 26, and 27 of Block A are part of this building. I can't tell you the exact amount of this building, but it's somewhere about Jim's desk going that way or something. And probably, it goes that way, those all the way over to the street. That was part of this particular subdivision. Earl had a patriot by the name of William Ewing, his great-great-grandfather, and he served at the Battle of Point Pleasant. Now, as I said, and I'm getting close here, so don't get too antsy. As I said, there's sometimes a confusion about the First Baptist Church. Sometimes people say, well, I thought Dillard was involved in it. Well, Dillard did too, was also involved in it. James Lafayette Dillard of Pittsville, of Virginia, he owned a part of this property too, eventually, after one sale after another, but he also owned the land where Dillard Street is, right across from the church. And so Dillard was also involved in this. And this is from the family history of Thomas Jefferson Dillard. As I said earlier, in the 1800s, some of the most popular names for the first and middle names of our Central Florida pioneers came from Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington. In the case of Mr. Dillard, his patriot was Thomas Jefferson Dillard Jr., who led a company to take over the Royal Governor Island in, I think that was in Maryland, in Virginia. Take Gwynn's Island, the Royal Governor's residence. He was involved in taking possession of that. So, a lot of what I've been doing now has been tied to the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Sons of the American Revolution. I got very interested in the daughters when I went to Mount Vernon. My wife and I went there many years, and it seems it was longer than I guess it seems like. It seems like a couple years ago, but I think it was probably a decade ago. But anyway, that was the home of George Washington, and when you walk around, you think, wow, this is really quite an accomplishment how they've restored it. And it's even more so when you find out that this wasn't government money that restored it. Back in the 1830s, late 30s, a young woman from South Carolina decided that she wanted to try and figure out a way to save George Washington's home because it was falling apart. It was almost ready to fall down. It was that bad. I have photos in my book of when they actually had to put rafters, support beams up to keep the porch ceiling from collapsing. So this woman wanted to take over and wanted to restore it. And so she had this idea that she wanted every American to send $1. And that $1, if every American would send $1, they could buy it, restore it, and then open it up so that the public could come and enjoy George Washington's home. The problem with her idea is that about 5 or 10 years earlier, some guys came up with the exact same idea to build the Washington Monument on the National Mall. They wanted to build the highest, tallest structure in the world, 500 feet tall, and in order to do it, they wanted every American to send $1. Well, what happened after about 10 years or so, they had built this Washington Monument about 140 feet, and that was as high as they could get it because they ran out of money and people stopped sending them money. And so the press had a field day when this lady from South Carolina says, what I want to do is I want every woman, or everybody in America, I want them to send $1. Well, I got a picture in here anyway, of the halfway completed. So anyway, she got a lot of bad press out of it, but one by one, she had this idea. I can't by myself get everybody in the United States to send in $1. So what I'll do is I'll get one woman from every state to be my vice regent. And that woman from every state can get people from their counties, and the counties can get people from the city, and we can all collect this money. And so she organized the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which still operates today and still runs the Mount Vernon home. Everything that you go to see there has been completely restored by the vision of her and the women who joined with her to make this organization. Well, that was in the late 1830s. By 1890, another group of women decided that they wanted to save American history as well. And so they organized the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they followed the exact same blueprint. They had a vice regent from every state that would organize the membership, and they have a very strict membership. And to this day, the Daughters of the American Revolution is as strong as ever. They started a year after the Sons of the American Revolution started. And the reason the Daughters started was that they were joining the Sons, and the Sons says, whoa, 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 we don't want women in our organization. So the Daughters, you're not allowed to join our organization. So they said, okay, we're going to start our own organization. And today, the Daughters of the American Revolution has thousands more members than the Sons. But they both do some great, great things. And because of that, I really got interested in this story of those women. You can read stories about how the Mount Vernon and the Daughters came about as a structure, but this deals with more of the women, the history of the women. And so because of that, that's how I kind of got involved with that. And I'm very proud to say that the National Library in Washington, D.C. has my book in their library. So with that, I hope I gave you a little bit different perspective of our particular community here, is that we really have, as I said earlier, 1 out of 9 people in America have ties to the American Revolution, but here in Winter Garden, just about every pioneer that I came across has ties to the American Revolution. So I think they were inspired. I really do. I think these pioneers who came here that had nothing, they left a little bit of civilization in Michigan, Ohio, New York, New England, and they came down here and had nothing. And from that, they built up this community that is extraordinary today. And with that, if you have any questions, I will be happy to try and answer. Before I do, though, I'd like to remind afterwards, at least if you'd like to take a look at my books, Jim will sell them. And proceeds, part of the proceeds go to support this fine institution. And Stephen, what would you?
What year?
What year? 8. I should know that, but my brain, the older I get, I think it was 1839, 1840. Huh?
The first U.S. postage stamp was not until 1847.
So they didn't do mail? Is that what you're saying? I'm not sure what they did with the money. I know that each region, the Florida region, there's photos of each region. Our particular Florida region was had been married to Akil Murat. Her name. Boy, I must be wearing myself out. You know, I usually always remember these things, but she was a grandniece of George Washington, and she was accepted in as the very first regent, or by special invitation. And again, I have a photo of her in here, but were they? Was she? And when was she a regent? Huh? No, I mean about what time? What? Yeah. Another DAR lady. This is Octavia Walton Levert. She was actually Alabama's first regent, but her father was George Walton, and George Walton brought her to Tallahassee, and when they were trying to come up with a name for Tallahassee, she came up with she's credited with naming the Tallahassee. So there's a great, yes, sir.
I want to say also, the Daughters of the American Revolution, a local chapter, they meet here every month.
Great.
We give them the space, and they also gave so much of their free time on July 4th when we hosted the All-American Kids Parade. They were there handing out decorations, just talking about the parade. They helped with art promotions. They are a great group of.
It is. It's a great, great organization. And what they do, there's a house, the Eustis Historical Society closed up, and they used to occupy the Clifford Mansion right on Lake Eustis up there. And it was there was nothing they could do with it, and so the city took it over. But just recently, the DAR has erected a plaque there about the founder of Eustis, Guilford Clifford, who actually built that house. And so that's the kind of stuff they do. They go around and put up plaques and things, and they're a very active organization, and they're very strict about getting in. You just don't say, oh, my great-great-great-grandfather was so-and-so. You have to actually prove it. And I think, Warren, you had a...
Yeah, you mentioned one of the founders, early settlers, was slave owners, but you didn't mention about the others. All basically slave owners or slave owners?
No, the only actual slave owner, well, I have to take that back. James Spear had a slave lady that Isaphena's parents gave her for working in the house. I don't know if James Spear had. I think he only had that one slave. By the time that Stark moved over to Stark Lake with his plantation in 1860, that's when Civil War broke out, and almost all of the slaves in Orange County were vanished from here. Another slave owner was William Delk, who had Rock Springs, and he had a number of slaves. As soon as the Civil War broke out, he let all of his slaves go. And William Delk teamed up with Isaac Rutland because Delk did not want Florida to secede either. So there was probably other slaves, but none really show up in records. Yes, sir.
The first roper that came, he came with slaves.
You did? Oh, that's right. Yeah, Roper brought slaves. Yeah, I stand corrected. Of the 34, I think it's 34 covered wagons that came down from Meriwether, Georgia, was William C. Roper, and he brought slaves with him. Anybody else? Well, I certainly appreciate you coming tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you.